Welcome to the WRAL Daily Download. I'm Grace Holland. New developments in a high-profile triangle murder case. The suspect accused of killing UNC student Faith Hedgepeth now faces new charges, this time related to drugs in jail. He appeared in court on those charges days after his defense team filed new court documents in the murder case. WRAL's Monica Casey joins me with the details on all of this. Monica, thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me.
So it's been over, I think, 12 years since Faith Hedgepeth was killed. In the last week, there's just been a lot of interesting things going on in this case. So let's start with what played out in the courtroom when it came to these drug charges.
Yes, absolutely. So Miguel Salguero-Olivares faces 3 new charges. It's a separate case from the murder case, and these charges are for possession of drugs while in jail, possession of methamphetamine, and then possession of methamphetamine with intent to distribute. So those charges were filed last month, and hearing in court was going to be what's called a probable cause hearing. So he was not brought over from the jail. His attorney represented him in front of the judge, and his defense team has filed a motion asking to do independent testing of the alleged drugs that he is charged with having while in jail. His team is arguing that he has multiple prescriptions, and one of them is known to cause false positive results for meth. So the state, the prosecutors in this case, made a motion to continue this case over to September, and that defense attorney agreed. And so they are going to hear that motion for independent testing in September and basically get back to it then.
Okay. And, for people who maybe are just playing catch up on this, when was he charged in the Faith Hedgepeth case?
Yeah, Grace, you mentioned how long this case has been going on. So Faith Hedgepeth was murdered back in 2012, and Salguero-Olivares was linked to this case from DNA evidence that was collected in a drunk driving stop back in 2021. So he was officially arrested and charged in September of 2021. So he has been waiting for trial for a long time now, almost 4 years, and he's been under no bond that entire time, which is standard when someone is charged with first-degree murder. As this case has gone through the court, we've been following really each filing as it comes through, and some of those records show why this is taking so long. In this case, given how long ago it was, there is so much discovery, which is what they basically call the evidence for both sides, the prosecution and the defense, to go through. A translator is needed for some things. They're going through social media posts, and there's a lot of forensic testing that has to be done. So that's one reason this is taking so long.
Right. And what did we learn from those filings last week about the case? His defense team put these out, and what does it appear that tells us about the case that they're building for the trial?
Yeah, so his defense team filed 3 motions. One of them is for permission, essentially, to call an out-of-state witness, letting the court know they want to do that. A second motion is for an expert witness, and then the third motion is for the release of more evidence to the defense team for testing. And that last motion is a little bit of a clue that if they still want to do more testing of evidence, we probably have a long way to go before we actually get to trial. So in these motions, the defense attorneys want to call a former UNC student who knew Faith Hedgepeth and her roommate as a witness for the defense. They say that witness is going to testify that he was friendly with Hedgepeth and her roommate, and after hanging out with them at a club the night of the murder, Hedgepeth's roommate asked him to come pick her up from her apartment around 4 in the morning. That witness says that Hedgepeth's roommate was upset, and when she got in his car, she had blood on her fingers. Now, that blood was tested by Chapel Hill police at the time, but there wasn't enough DNA to match who that blood belonged to. The defendant's attorneys are also saying that notes from police and the medical examiner at the time place Hedgepeth's blood alcohol content at a level where they say she would have been dead before this roommate left the apartment. apartment. That's a big part of the defense's argument here. And then lastly, they want an expert witness to examine the fingerprints on a Bacardi bottle that was found near Hedgepeth's body. That's kind of the crux of the second and third motions that were recently filed. They argue that while the SBI tested the fingerprints on the bottle at the time and they weren't able to match them to anyone, the defense says their experts are going to be able to testify that those fingerprints do not match Salguero-Olivares, the man who's been arrested for this murder. They also want their expert to compare other people's fingerprints, including Hedgepeth and her roommates, to those fingerprints on the bottle. So a lot of moving parts and moving pieces here. But in essence, these motions want to call a new witness to talk about what was happening that night, and they want to do more testing on the evidence that was tested at the time in 2012 to see what they can find from that.
Let's take a quick break right there. When we come back, we're going to talk a little bit more about these drug charges. Monica, let's go back to these drug charges. Have there been other contraband issues at the Durham County Detention Center?
There have been, and we've covered them here at WRAL. And so contraband can be a cell phone or maybe pieces to build a cell phone, and then drugs. We also have covered issues of weapons in the jail. A lot of time, the majority of the times, those weapons are handmade or homemade there in the jail. The sheriff, in a recent budget conversation with Durham County commissioners, said they were confiscating an average of 20 weapons per month in the Durham County Detention Center. When it comes to contraband coming from outside the detention center, back in October of last year, a former sergeant with the sheriff's office was charged with providing essentially pieces to put together a cell phone. And in that same time period, a nurse who was contracted to work at the detention center, so she wasn't a sheriff's office employee, but she was kind of an independent civilian contractor, she was charged with conspiracy to sell drugs, and she was accused of bringing marijuana inside the jail for an inmate to then sell to other detainees there.
Okay. And do we have a sense of how common that kind of contraband or drugs are in jails nationwide and how Durham County compares?
Well, we know it's definitely not just a Durham issue, and we've covered contraband in jails in other detention centers right here in our area. For example, in Wake County, about 3 months ago, a detention officer was arrested for supplying drugs to inmates. And then over in Vance County, we've covered a lot of issues at that detention center. Over there, 4 officers were actually fired after allegations of them delivering contraband. So it's an issue in multiple detention centers in our area. We also were able to pull data from the federal prison system to show how drugs are getting into federal jails. And so the majority comes from visitation. In 38% of the cases, those drugs are people have visited and they've passed drugs to detainees or inmates. Mail is also a problem. 23% of drugs in the federal system are coming from mail. And then prison employees, whether that's a independent contractor or a corrections officer, 18% of cases nationwide in the federal prison system, the drugs are coming from a prison employee. We also got some data on what drugs are the most common in the federal prison system. So 48% of the drugs that are found or confiscated are buprenorphine. I might be butchering the pronunciation on that, but that's an opioid drug. Marijuana makes up about 41% of the drugs, and then methamphetamine is 22%.
And given those statistics, it'll be really interesting to see, as the investigation continues into how these alleged drugs ended up in his possession, or whether it was a false positive, where that all stand. As you said, the timeline, it's been continued until September at this point. So how long do we think it could be before we know more about those drug charges, whether that testing comes back positive or negative? And then at the same time, with the murder trial, allegedly supposed to start in the next year or so, but that could take some time as well. is it possible that the drug charges could, I guess, continue past when the trial could start, or vice versa?
Yes, so many different things to follow. So the next hearing on the drug charges will be September 9th, and at that hearing, they're going to hear the motion for independent testing. So they can't even test it until September, so that certainly might take a while. The next hearing on the murder charges isn't until about October 16th. We have those new motions that have been filed, so it may be possible that those are heard earlier, but we probably have a ways to go on that as well. If they are able to get that evidence to test it, that testing will take more time too. So it's anyone's guess which one of these cases is resolved first, but it wouldn't be unusual for the drug charges to maybe outlast the murder charges, and we'll see kind of where those end up.
Thank you so much, Monica, and thank you for listening to the WRAL Daily Download and for making us part of your morning routine. Another great way to get WRAL news is the Morning Briefing newsletter. It's a daily email with Triangle news, events, and headlines to help you get ready for the day. Sign up at WRAL.com/newsletter.